Okay, everybody. I know there's some people that are still filtering in, but welcome back from lunch. I'm sorry that we may have run out of lunches because there's a lot of you, and I hope you got a chance to eat anyway. And we might get a couple more lunches tomorrow, so we don't have that problem again. But great to see everybody back. So this next panel is really this next paper is really great serendipity. Obviously, what we have is a discussion of robotics in the healthcare setting with an emphasis on industry. And it happens to be that at the University of Washington, we have one of the directors in our medical school, which is one of the best medical schools around, who has medical training. She's an RN and a JD. And she specifically works with industry relations between the medical school, and more specifically still has worked on relations around robots, around robot surgery and so forth. So it's like an extremely good fit with Cindy here. And so I'm going to allow her to present Drew and his colleagues' paper. Drew, can you name all your co-authors for me when you come for your comments so we can recognize them? I love this paper, and I'm delighted to hear what you guys have to say. So thanks a lot.
Thanks. So I would direct you all to the abstract for the paper, which is a really great summary. And the paper is organized very nicely. Begins with kind of it could be the Jetsons one day, but it's not right now. So let's back up and see what we're actually dealing with. And then does a really nice job of talking about where is the demand coming from for robotics in healthcare? Where is it intersecting with where we've already been? That's my take on it. And what are the issues that are being addressed in piecemeal fashion or not at all? And what should we be looking ahead to in terms of trying to make this path a little easier, so that we can actually improve healthcare through the use of technology? And obviously that's been going on for a very long time. So by a little bit of, by way of my background, I was a clinician for 11 years. I was a registered nurse and an ARNP. And then I went to law school, and I've done pretty much exclusively health law since then. I do work at the School of Medicine, as Ryan said. I'm the director of business projects, and so I get involved in most of our negotiations with industry vendors for medical devices. I haven't had a whole lot of interaction yet with any robotics except for Da Vinci, right? Not surprising. And that's kind of the if you look at it, it's just a laparoscope on steroids, right? So, so it's a natural development of stuff that I remember from way back in the dark ages when I was in clinical care. So we do work with Da Vinci, but the other intersections in my world that made this article really speak to me were the fact that I teach FDA law here at UW Law School. And so, yes, I try to lead people through the quagmire that is their regulatory scheme. And I also teach a telemedicine tutorial. So a lot of this technology involves telemedicine technology, right? And so it's a broader issue around the explosion in healthcare technology. And one of the general problems I found, and this isn't just limited to healthcare, obviously, but the technology goes first, healthcare comes later, and the law comes last. So, trying to piece those together. So, I'm just going to go on and talk a little bit about each of the sections of the paper. As I said, it's very nicely organized. It starts with where are the demands for robotics in healthcare and what are the possible benefits. One of the biggest factors that's pointed out in the paper is we have such an aging population in the US, obviously, and elsewhere around the world. And there is a caregiver crisis in our country, for sure, that intersects and bumps up against an increasing demand on the part of older folks who want to age in place, right? They want to stay in their homes, but they need a lot of help. And we either don't have enough properly trained caregivers, and everybody's read the stories about adult family homes that have improperly trained folks that neglect their residents. And you know, there's no reason to think that it's a whole lot better if you're just going to hire somebody to come into your home. So the paper talks about, wouldn't this be a good use for an actual autonomous robot, which is why the paper almost immediately leaps right over, you know, my dealings with robotics, which is Da Vinci. And that's really just, it doesn't act on its own. It's an extension of the surgeon. It's, to be sure, a much more sophisticated extension of the surgeon than laparoscopic tools, but it still doesn't do anything by itself. So there's a discussion about this huge aging in place issue, and not only a discussion of robots to help out older folks with their healthcare needs, but with their actual physical needs, mobility, meals, things like that. And that's the first place that the paper starts to talk about, okay, necessarily we're bleeding out of the healthcare world when we talk about this, and into the personal world as well. Another point that the paper makes in this first section is that there's another potential source of need for robotics, and that's to help with the cost of healthcare, so actually inside healthcare facilities. So automating certain tasks, assisting healthcare workers, and some of that, again, has been around, right? I mean, I remember spending a long period of time getting medications ready to pass because we did everything by hand. Well, now the Pyxis machine does most of that for you. But you still have to pass it, but what's the next step? So another point that wasn't mentioned in the paper, and I don't know whether you might want to say something about it, is we also have the healthcare personnel shortage that kind of waxes and wanes, right? So that's another potential reason why we might want to use robotics for actual assistance for healthcare workers. And then the third thing that the paper mentions is robotics in healthcare are good in terms of being consistent with the push now for personalized medicine. That is definitely true. It's taking place everywhere. Precision medicine, genetic targeted drugs. So it's going on everywhere. And why not have that same mindset has gone into people's thinking about their healthcare plans. Everybody wants something to be personalized for them. And so we have this explosion of wearable healthcare stuff, right? So then the paper goes into, in the next section, what exactly are we talking about in terms of robotic types? Well, surgical robots, obviously, are mentioned. The Da Vinci is a great example. There are obviously, there are all kinds of surgical pieces of equipment that use technology that, you know, could be considered to be this close to a robotic assistance, right? Because everything's programmed in. And for example, for eye surgery, you know, it's more like flying a plane than actually wielding the old kind of surgical instruments, because you set everything up with the dials. Routine task robots, again, that's just bringing stuff to people, carting specimens. It's today's version of the pneumatic tube, right? When I worked as a clinician, we put all our lab specimens in pneumatic tubes, and we thought we were very futuristic. And then personal care robots, and those are the more, again, targeted to not necessarily healthcare stuff. Can use a robot to help move folks, to actually do medications, for example. And then what if you combine a robot with a device? Now the robot can take the patient's vital signs, right? So from my perspective, as I've mentioned, all of this stuff kind of came out of where we started back at the beginning of electronic monitoring. That was the first piece. You know, we hooked I worked in the neonatal intensive care unit, and we couldn't see our kids for the forest of stuff that we had attached to them. But that was telling us everything about our kids. Well, we thought so. And I was doing NICU right before pulse ox, so we didn't even have pulse ox. But we sure had a lot of stuff on our kids. And then we had assistive aids as well, right? We had mechanical lifts. We had all kinds of stuff to help us out. And I kind of see robotics as taking the two and smushing them together. Sounds a lot like mobile medical apps, right? So, and I'll talk about that. The paper talks about that in the last section when it talks about the current regulatory framework. So next section of the paper does zero in on one of the more distinctive things about robotics in healthcare, which is data collection and use. And there are a lot of issues around data collection and use in robotics. And it's both a matter of quantity and quality, right? So we're dealing with an unprecedented amount of data that can possibly be collected in this way, and not limited to robots, right? What types of data can be collected? How sensitive is that data? How reliable is the data? That's a big issue for mobile medical apps and devices that use them. Again, privacy issues, security issues, anytime you're talking about collecting health data or other sensitive data. And as I mentioned, what about if you connect it to a device? Now you take the robot and you connect it to a device, or you make one of its functions just like a device. Taking blood pressure, as simple as taking blood pressure. Well, the FDA is very interested in that, right? And they've used that criterion connected to a medical device as one of the factors that you should look at in determining whether or not you think the FDA is going to regulate your mobile medical app or your mobile app, depending on what they call it. And for now, we've concluded that your guess is as good as holding a piece of paper up to your head like Johnny Carson used to do. The FDA has attempted to clarify its mobile medical app guidance, and it's better. I think it's better than it was, but it's still not a model of clarity. So that's a nice segue into the last section of the paper before the conclusion, which talks about the regulatory framework and breaks it up nicely into device regulation, which is the purview of the FDA still, and data protection. So device regulation, the FDA has said over and over again, and I can't imagine that they wouldn't regulate robotics as devices kind of combined with a medical app, or any type of, for example, they've been promising guidance on clinical decision support systems for, what, 4 years? Something like that? Because they came right out with the first draft of mobile medical app guidance and said, we don't care about the platform. We care about the functionality. So we really don't care that these are mobile. Well, except to the extent that they're going to wind up being used by consumers, right? But the FDA is trying to look at it as, what's the functionality? So that's what they're all about in their mobile medical app guidance. How does this thing function? And it's very confusing. Even with, if you look at their guidance, they start off with definitions that are arguably outside their jurisdiction. For example, they define mobile app. Gee, thanks, right? They define mobile app manufacturer. But then they back up and say, okay, wait a minute. Is it a device? That's the first question you have to ask. And as the paper points out, the definition of device is extremely broad. So what you come out with is the FDA saying, well, we have potential jurisdiction over most of these. And the exceptions, if you look at them, are like electronic medical textbooks. As if anybody ever thought that was a device to begin with, that they consider outside their jurisdiction. Everything else, they pretty much said, we get to regulate that. Now, how closely we're going to regulate it will depend largely on the level of risk to the patient. And what they really care about is functionality. So in increasing order of concern to them are apps that provide information only. Next would be apps that provide information and recommendations for treatment, so somebody acts on that information. And then the thing that they want to regulate the most closely is an app that actually does something to the patient or triggers some action that affects the patient. So what their guidance says is you still have to figure out, is it a device? What class device is it? And remember, there are very few predicate devices for any of these things. So for a lot of them, you're going to be looking at potentially doing a pre-market submission, whether it's the easier 510K or the more involved hoop jumping exercise of pre-market approval. The FDA potentially would be looking at a lot of these. I don't think that they've thought about how swamped they might be, but that's never stopped them before. So, the FDA also did interestingly come out with a guidance last fall around cybersecurity. Again, their concern is about the functionality of the device. They don't want the device to malfunction. That's their whole thing about cybersecurity. Now, sort of peripherally, a lot of the security that they are recommending would also address some privacy concerns. But if you look at the FDA's mission, they don't really care too much about privacy. So then, nice segue into the next section of the paper. Well, who does care about privacy? And does the FDA care enough about security to be able to regulate it? So this is where we have another fragmentation. So right now in healthcare, as everybody knows, privacy is regulated pretty much by HIPAA. But that only applies to covered entities and their business associates. What about all these apps that are out there being used at home? Absolutely, nothing to do with HIPAA. And HIPAA is increasingly focusing on data security standards as well as privacy standards. And there's not necessarily consistency between HIPAA and state laws on privacy and security, although they can only be more restrictive than HIPAA, right? And again, the big problem is that with a lot of robotics and other healthcare technology, mobile medical apps and such that are going to be used out in the home, okay, the FDA cares that the app functions correctly and secure enough that way, but what about data protection for privacy purposes, for information theft? Well, in healthcare, we're not the only people worried about that, right? So the paper talks about, well, wouldn't it make sense to have the FTC have more discretion around all kinds of data security? Because what we're looking at in terms of data is just so wildly different than the schemes that are in place today ever contemplated. I remember looking back at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in which has been around since 1990, which is pre-HIPAA. And I remember, you know, even at that time, they were concerned about things like metadata. And now we have data mining. We have extremely sensitive data because the technology is, well, really is Facebook spying on you through your camera phone? And this is the kind of thing that you could imagine people would be concerned about with a mobile medical app. Because you're actually, in a lot of those, you're uploading information to your provider. We have a wound evaluator that's being piloted right now that uploads information directly from the patient to the provider. And we're doing all kinds of telemedicine where right now we're working with industry to potentially broadcast a surgery via satellite to a large audience 3 states away. Well, guess what I'm concerned about? I'm concerned about the data when it's in transmission. So, you know, it's the same kind of thing. So there are overarching concerns about our world of data. It's not just limited to robotic data or mobile medical app data. And it does make sense to, as the paper suggests, let HIPAA take care of disclosure concerns for covered entities, and then give the FTC more overarching control over data security of all kinds. And then, of course, the paper makes a great point, which I preach all the time, which is, come on, FDA. You got to shift in your approach, which people have been saying for years, obviously. One of the problems with the FDA is that the Act, the original 1938 Act, is still in place. It has been amended about 1,000 times, but I don't think we're ever going to get a complete replacement because, you know, it's like getting tentacles out of something. So, unfortunately, the FDA's jurisdiction is still kind of all over the place, but if they will shift their approach, I think it would be very helpful and would result in fewer headaches for some of us who are trying to figure out what they're doing. So that's kind of the paper in a nutshell from my perspective. And if you have questions or like to have Drew talk about the paper and what he really meant, right?
No, that was such a great summary. Thank you. I was so excited when Ryan told me that Cindy would be presenting, just because it is such a fantastic fit. And I really appreciate your insights from the FDA and everything. That was great. Thank you so much. So I'll keep my comments pretty brief, actually. I will acknowledge my co-authors. Nick Terry is a health law professor at the McKinney School of Law in Indianapolis. The IU McKinney School of Law. Kris Hauser, who I also co-authored with last year, is now an electrical and computer engineering professor at Duke. And then Missy Cummings, who actually does a lot in the drone space, but I talked her into joining on the healthcare paper, which I was thrilled about. So yeah, Missy Cummings, she's another engineering professor at Duke. I'm really glad that I got to go after the last panel before lunch, because I think it was a really great transition. There were a lot of things that were said that really resonated with me. But overall, I was amazed at how often healthcare came up in this year's papers. I think of the 11 that I read, I think it came up in one form or another in 9 of them, 9 out of the 11, which I think is really, really telling. And I mean, just on the last panel, you know, Peter's point about regulation not being reactionary, I think really resonates well in the healthcare setting. Kristen's point about keeping people comfortable with drones, I think that's going to be a huge thing in healthcare also. And then Woody's point about privacy has more competing values than safety, I think it really resonates well with this topic. And by the way, don't party too hard tonight because you don't want to miss a minute of Woody's panel first thing in the morning. And it's gonna he does an amazing job of outlining the broad powers of the FTC, and I think can be a nice continuation of this discussion too. But so I think the healthcare topic in the robot context is exceptional because I think healthcare is an exceptional area, and I think robots within healthcare are exceptional themselves too. The sensitivity of the healthcare space, not only in terms of the data that's being collected, but just the general day-to-day interactions, and the fact that now with the use of the cloud and cloud robotics, we're datifying all of those interactions. So traditional privacy concerns are now data security and privacy concerns. And healthcare is also in a lot of ways an essential area of law. So we're not just talking about elective devices that we use for entertainment. This is an area that people rely on for their health and their own well-being. And robots in that area are someday maybe going to be an essential interaction that we have to deal with, and we need to acknowledge that and address these issues accordingly. Healthcare is also expanding in really interesting ways out of the traditional setting and more into the homes and everything. And there's a lot of issues that arise from that. So in trying to decide the scope of this paper, though, and I would welcome feedback on how good of a job we did in appropriately limiting it, but there's lots of overlap, obviously, with Internet of Things and big data. But we kind of tried to identify the areas where there's going to be the most regulatory turbulence, where maybe we can do something about it, and thought that device regulation, data protection regimes were big. Also, I think eventually licensure regulation of the practice of medicine is going to be a big deal, but probably deserves a paper of its own. So we kind of thought that medical device regulation and data protection were kind of an area that we can do something about. When you picture a healthcare robot, I think a lot of people picture like a Baymax from Big Hero 6, kind of this all-purpose. If you haven't seen Big Hero 6, definitely go see it. So this all-purpose healthcare companion, we're going to see that in the consumer setting, and then we're going to see, eventually robot doctors in the hospital setting. But they're going to kind of evolve in both these separate settings and be subject to different laws along the way, and we need to think about that up front. So I like how we ended up with the scope of our paper, because there's a lot of progress being made with robotics in healthcare, and I think nothing could derail that progress faster than a high-profile privacy violation or data security breach. So I think that's all the more reason we need to address these issues up front. So I'm not saying that in not looking too far ahead to healthcare companion type robots, I'm not saying that robots aren't an issue now. I think they are an issue now. We just have to be careful with how we focus on it. Boy, with that, I might go ahead and actually open it up to questions, I think, or comments.
Hi, it's Michael Frumkin again. So the abstract of the paper had a phrase in it that I really liked, 2/3 of, and I want to sort of encourage you to, so you wrote here that one of the goals of the paper is to try to maximize the potentials of robots, which includes taking into consideration potential issues that could have overlooked, manifest themselves in ways that harms patient consumers, diminish the trust of key stakeholders of robots in healthcare, and stifle long-term innovation. I'm thinking, yes. He's onto the problem. And then it turns out that it's resulting in overly restrictive reactionary regulations where it goes. And that's one frame you can take. And the issues you talk in the paper are really kind of about that in a way. But what I'd like to encourage you to do, since you invited talks about frames, is to think about the problem as not Internet of Things, but the place of robots in data ecology. And what that kind of framing does for you is it lets you talk about another related problem, which is in implementation, in acceptance of these tools, tied to the things you talk about, but very rarely linked to them in regulation. And that's the interaction with the tort system. So I worked a few years ago with the Medical Foundation that wanted to encourage people to come up with innovative ways, to put things in teddy bears, to encourage children, to have people take their medicine, and to collect all sorts of biometric data about people. And it turned out that one of the top, maybe the top obstacle to all this is that the doctors are terrified of the data stream because they're afraid that they will not be able to process the data. It may not be compatible with their system. Even if it's compatible with their system, it's a tsunami of information whose reliability is uncertain. And that if they miss something, they will be held liable for negligence for not having paid attention to it. So that's a critical part of the data ecology, is how information we use and how failure to use information could be used. And again, the FDA doesn't worry about that problem. It's not the FDA's job. But it's our job in thinking about how to encourage adoption of these things and to milk them for as much benefit as we can, to understand the legal and information ecology into which they're going. So I invite you to add that frame to here. It's hard work. Please do it for me.
No, that's great. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Yeah. No, that's great.
And that's a problem, again, across the board. We're having that problem with some of our medical app projects, where we've got patients submitting data through the app, and it's not going into the medical record. Yeah, but where is it going? And who's looking at it? And what are they doing with it? And is that a med mal claim waiting to happen?
Yes.
So everybody's worried about that. Yeah.
Aragon from UW Electrical Engineering. Since I don't know anything about medical technology, I'd like you to say whether there's anything apart from the scale, which will get very much worse when you have huge numbers of devices, and in these times, almost whenever you say the word device, you almost have to mean communication device. But apart from the explosion in scale caused by that, is there any existing example that medical people know about that we can extrapolate from, where you have equipment or devices that might be individually regulated or understood pretty well, but you recognize that there are also good or bad outcomes that you can get from a whole system of those devices, so that are there cases that we know about now that there's some way of dealing with from which we could extrapolate, or is it really a brand new problem where you have interactions between individually certifiable things that need to be looked at as an entire system? Because I'm thinking that from now on there kind of only will be entire systems, that the devices themselves will always at some point in their lives be communicating with other devices.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole idea behind cloud robotics too, and one of the things that makes this a really complicated area, because you're the robot itself, whether it's in the hospital or whether it's in the home, is going to have the manufacturer, if it's affiliated with a healthcare provider, there's another party, the cloud service provider, the internet service provider. Under HIPAA now, the third parties and business associates are directly liable now to HIPAA. So there's kind of some evolution there in acknowledging the complexities that are being introduced by this. Can you think of any?
Well, the one example I thought of that's been around for forever is telemetry. And telemetry is a bunch of individual patient monitors, usually cardiac. And if you stand right in front of the individual patient's monitor, you're looking at that patient's data. But there's no reason why, and particularly now that we're using that type of monitoring equipment to feed that data into clinical decision support systems, it's just the next step to develop an algorithm from that data that then comes back down to our decisions for other patients. The wound evaluator is a great example of that. Their premise is, we think we know what the harbingers of surgical site infection are, but we'd like to actually gather data from patients, and then we'd like to analyze that data. And maybe we're going to come up with some new harbingers based on what ultimately happens to those patients. So you can do that with telemetry data as well. People who do experience a cardiac event while they're on telemetry, you back that data up and look at it. So I think that's going on all the time now. And you know, when it started, it was just, we want to know what's going on with this patient right now in this moment. So I think it's a natural expansion.
Corey Kraft from Oregon State. This might derail the conversation a little bit, but a lot of what it seems you talk about in your paper relates to data. That's what the conversation has been about. So I'm wondering, is what you're examining, does it all reduce to network security issues? Are there other aspects that you're examining or contemplating either currently or for the future that really tie into the actual human-robot interaction in the sphere, in the setting of the healthcare place?
I mean, network security is definitely a huge part of it. And you know, I kind of give a head nod at the end of the paper toward, okay, whether it's the hospital or the home, yeah, it's not just all in the design of the robot itself. There's other issues that you have to take into consideration, but that, you know, designers also have to understand the environments that these robots are going to be deployed in and what the vulnerabilities are going to be. And that's kind of what the cybersecurity guidance, you know, gets at, is taking these risks into consideration from the beginning. In terms of the human-robot interaction, yeah, I think a lot of it does kind of go back to the fact that we're datafying all these interactions that are taking place, and when you're utilizing the cloud, you really have to know a lot about not only the you know, sort of the direct health information that any device might have or current medical record might have, and getting access to those, but also generating a ton of new information. If the robot is gonna be successful in an unstructured hospital or home environment, they're gonna have to know information about everything for mapping their environment, for recognizing objects. It's kind of opening up kind of a whole new world in that sense. So, you know, privacy and security are really big, broad issues, but approaching it from a data security and data privacy standpoint, I think is just kind of a good place to start in addressing those, and hopefully crafting a regulatory environment, both on the device side and the general data security side, that we can be attuned to security and privacy considerations from the beginning, and have a regulatory environment that can then be in a position to address those larger kind of human-robot interaction and policy and ethical concerns along the way.
Plus the FDA, for example, would be taking the device regulation side, and again, they don't really care about privacy, and they don't care about data security to the extent that has privacy ramifications. What they care about in data security is, does the robot use data, or the app, or the device, let's just say the device, does the device use data in order to function? If it uses data in order to function, is that data reliable? That's what they care about. And that all ultimately goes to the two things that you have to demonstrate if you're going to get a device cleared by the FDA. Is it safe, and is it efficacious? So you have to be able to demonstrate that, you know, that your device isn't going to zap a person, burn a person, and does it work? Is it efficacious for its intended purpose? And that's where you need clinical data. So I think that data security, for other reasons, is kind of outside the FDA's thinking, but are you going to harm somebody? That's the first thing they look at if they're going to use this device. What is this device going to do? And the more it acts on the patient and the more invasive it is, the more concerned they get about it.
And like with the cybersecurity guidance, I think it could lead to better privacy, sort of indirectly. It's not,
it kind of
not
has
their
to,
intent.
because
but,
what they're
yeah.
concerned about is, can somebody get in here and mess it up so that it's not safe anymore? But if you're going to follow, the guidance criteria that they lay out for you so nobody can get in and mess it up, well, it's going to be more private as well at the same time.
And I wish I do wish they'd change their mindset on that a little bit too. And it wouldn't take such a huge leap. In the FTC's Internet of Things report, they acknowledge that data security, better data security also leads to better physical security. They actually acknowledge that in their report. And I think that's the FTC is showing the exact right kind of open-mindedness that you need to be regulating emerging technologies with. And so, expanding, the FDA's review to kind of include more privacy wouldn't, because they're already looking at cybersecurity, we wouldn't even necessarily be changing what they're looking at, only how they're looking at it. And I think a lot of good could come from that.
So, Drew, really great job on the paper. To your co-authors as well, I enjoyed reading your work, and this was no exception. And I want to push a little further on something that both you and I actually neglected to write about in our papers, but is very important, which is the question of regulatory authority with respect to challenges. And so the FTC is able to regulate data security because Section 5 is so broad. Right, and was designed, in fact, to be so broad. And as you know, that authority, particularly with respect to data security, is being challenged in the Wyndham case and in the LabMD case specifically. And if the challenges to that authority succeeds, then we're going to have a lot of stuff that we kind of safely assume the FTC could regulate up for grabs. And now it's going to be in question, data security being one of them. And so my question is not about that or how you think that's going to turn out, but instead I'm really curious, if the FTC loses, and it loses the ability to regulate data security and to regulate other forms of robotics, which I can talk about tomorrow, what would your ideal design be for healthcare robots? Does it go to HHS? Do we rethink what the FDA is capable of, or do we pass legislation to make sure that the FTC can regulate data security? And if so, what do those rules look like? Mm-hmm. Is it case by case? Is it rulemaking? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hope it doesn't fail.
Right.
Because I think the FTC is critical in filling in the current gaps. But the FTC has also called for making HIPAA broader and taking into account the fact that the traditional notion of the covered entity is going to become kind of arbitrary. The more, we're seeing it with smart homes and with mobile medical apps and everything. It's going to become kind of arbitrary. I think the idea behind the paper, I think, is that we can strengthen all of them. I think the FDA can step up in expanding the way that they're already looking at cybersecurity to include broader harms and non-physical harms. And in the same way that the FTC thinks that HIPAA could probably reconsider, who it applies to and take into consideration the complexity of the parties that are now basically doing the same thing as covered, dealing with the same information as covered entities, even if they don't count. A federal robotics commission too?
Someone should propose something like that.
Yeah. And I think, eventually I think something like the Federal Robotics Commission could take on quite a bit of this load. Ideally, at first, I think they'd be best in advising the FDA on the areas where they're expanding, where they might not feel the most comfortable, like trying to get into privacy and stuff. So I would hope maybe that would be taken into consideration to any challenges that, this isn't a job for the FTC, or this isn't a job for the FDA. I think that's where a Federal Robotics Commission could come in.
I don't know what you're looking at me. Can I have a quick follow-up question? So quick follow-up question to Woody's. So, we're going to definitely get to your question too. Is the FDA making not great decisions because it doesn't understand robots? You know what I mean? And one thing, if it didn't understand privacy, because if it didn't understand privacy, it could ask Woody, it could ask the FTC, which has a lot of expertise there. It could ask the White House, and then the White House would say a bunch of things convenient for the White House. But but if it's about robots, right? And so one example that I would like to toss out there is, did the FDA, and this is as much for Cindy really, but for both of you, did the FDA move too fast in approving surgical robots on the analogy that functionally they're equivalent to laparoscopic surgery? Because you had commented earlier that they're just laparoscopic surgery on steroids, and that actually struck me, because if you look at the lawsuits and the complaints about surgical robots that are starting to occur, the complaints that are compiled by the FDA and the lawsuits that are actually in the courts, they tend to be things that are different from what laparoscopic surgery. People getting burned by wires, the thing shutting down in the middle of it and then having to switch to manual, all these things that are robot specific. And I think that a Federal Robotics Commission, for instance, might be able to come in and say, this is how the technology works, not so fast making an analogy to laparoscopic, for instance. And I wonder if I could get you to react to that, and then with apologies to the next question.
Yeah, I think that my take on that would be that the FDA has sort of come along in the device world, with the evolution of, okay, we went from cranks and screws to, then we started putting software and stuff. And my take would be that they really don't see any device that's got software in it, like a high-level disinfection system, for example. How is that different from the Da Vinci, right? Software is software is software. We've got software there's software in so many devices that my guess is, so their process for approving that is, again, do you need a 510K or do you need a PMA? Well, it depends on the risk of the device. So if it's a class 3 device, you need a PMA. That means you've got to have a lot more clinical evidence that it's safe and efficacious. And one of the problems with anything the FDA approves is that once it gets on the market, your population, your sample size just explodes, and then you start seeing stuff. So it doesn't surprise me that the Da Vinci, we're seeing different kinds of complications. The basis for the claims is the same. It's, are they preempted? Can they bring a product liability claim against the manufacturer? They can always bring a med mal claim against the operator. That doesn't change. But can they bring a product liability claim against the manufacturer? And that's still being analyzed under the same, preemption inquiry as any other device, which is pretty much right now, if it's a PMA, you've got preemption protection. It's 510K, you don't, because it's not a specific enough requirement. But yeah, I think it's, and in theory, the FDA has had expert advisory panels to help it on anything that it's trying to look at. So their typical thing is to gin up a guidance, right? And they've got you cited some in the paper, their guidance is on software. So I think one of the problems is they are always kind of a step behind. And then we try to, and then the courts try to deal with the cases using law that came from the 90s, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, and Ken Goldberg's work at UC Berkeley now, trying to make, because right now surgical robots are, surgical robots basically, but Ken Goldberg's work at UC Berkeley is trying to see how you can use the cloud to have these robots learn from each other as they perform more and more of these procedures, and eventually start lessening the role of the doctor and kind of taking on some of these surgeries on their own, which will raise a whole new set of concerns too. So I hope they're not behind on that one. Yeah.
This is a bit of a frolic and a detour, so feel free to speed bump it if you want to talk to me afterwards. But I actually was wondering, kind of in terms of regulatory schemes, if there is anything regulating kind of like the recycling, upcycling, dissolving in your system way to use these medical technologies. And I'm wondering this for two reasons. One, I'm a millennial and an environmentalist, so I'm curious to see if they're regulating any sort of the materials, and then like whether you can recycle the materials and stuff. And then second, my 89-year-old grandmother has a whole closet full of old iRobots And she won't get rid of them because she's very afraid that she might need them in the future or something. You know, and they're all 20-year-old technologies, and she's both concerned about the environment and about using. And I was wondering what sort of like questions that brings up in terms of not surgical robots and like the big, you know, hospital scene, but also as you get into homes, both like updating, you know, disposing of, et cetera. Those like the medical robots that help, particularly with elderly folks who may not be as quick to you know, advance or move on with technology.
That is interesting. I don't know a lot about the environmental side. The first thing that, not to bring up the effect of the cloud again, but the robots physically are going to become more nimble and lighter and not have as much material, and they're outsourcing their processing to the cloud now, so there's not going to be as many updates, there's not going to be as many old robots. All the updates are going to happen in the cloud, which I think would kind of make them more environmentally friendly, maybe? I don't know. Yeah.
No, in the healthcare setting, you know, you're pretty much governed by hazmat disposal laws, state laws, and so it's like, you know, what do we do with our old refrigerators?
I have a question for you all, just with regard to our collective lack of imagination in this area. So I've spent a lot of, Pat Kristen with the Media Group, I spent a lot of time interfacing with the FDA over the years, first in the context of HIV and now more recently with some other devices. So the average time it takes, the number of years it takes to move anything through that process, and now with the rate of the development of technology, there is such a temporal gap in those two that I can't imagine the FDA is ever going to be the place where we're going to find meaningful resolution of these issues. And in fact, I think the problem grows bigger by the day. And I think it introduces profound challenges both for innovation and as a very practical matter, I think about my kids who are already programming robots, doing things with their phone. They'll just create stuff that they'll be using on themselves and others, you know, no matter what the FDA has to say. So I'm curious about anything that you've thought of, whether it's in other settings, other contexts, anything that might just shift our mindsets out of thinking about these same institutions being the place for the answers, because I worry if that's the best we've got.
Yeah, I do too, and I mean, I think Federal Robotics Commission again is a nice way to kind of.
Say more about that.
I could defer to Ryan on that, but and probably should, but the way I would see it playing a role here is that you'd have to the extent that these kind of traditional regulatory entities might not understand robots. There are experts here in this room that know a heck of a lot about robots in all kinds of settings, and they could definitely serve as in an advisory role on what makes those issues hard. You know, none of these agencies are, and this is especially stark in the healthcare arena, none of these agencies are going to cover all the robots we're seeing. Devices are in the hospital mostly, but also in the home, but they have to perform those certain medical functions right now in order to fall under the FDA. HIPAA only applies to covered entities. That's mostly in the hospital now, but if...
I don't think that is not true of HIPAA. So all I'm saying is you're not landing into HIPAA because of the way the regulations are written that are not specifically in a hospital. And and that, I think that it's just going to accelerate in the way that these kinds of devices are specifically commercialized.
Yes, exactly. And you know, if a hospital sends a robot home with someone, HIPAA's still going to apply, even if the robot's not in the hospital. Exactly. Yeah.
But further, I'm saying, and the FDA will say it applies to the extent that the personalized medicine device starts concerning them about just what we were saying about those definitions, whether it's hospital-based or not. That, I think that's the place of massive innovation taking place. We don't think that's no ability to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best we can do right now is try to close the gaps within our existing framework. And I think there's ways we can do it with small changes, whether it's slightly expanding the role of the FDA or getting rid of the current sector-based limitations on the FTC. I think that would help close a lot of the gaps. But no, you're exactly right. Right now, the law thinks of robot patients and robot consumers. And I think we do need to move more toward thinking of robot users in general. I mean, by the time these caregiver, these personal caregivers advance, it's not going to matter whether it's in the hospital or the home or who made it. It's the problems are going to be the same, and the law should start moving in that direction. I think the best we can do right now is start to close the gaps and hopefully be attuned to things like privacy and security along the way, and then hopefully involve some kind of maybe overarching agency that takes into consideration the more nuanced challenges that come down the road. Mm-hmm.
Amend the act and the FDA could create a center for robotics. Mm-hmm. In theory, then would have the appropriate expertise. They've tried before to develop accelerated pathways, which seem to be doomed to failure because they're only accelerated in a relative sense. So, something like the GAIN Act for robotics would, was another possibility, which is supposed to, the GAIN Act is supposed to create incentives for accelerated pathways for antibiotics. But
hope you write that up, Cindy. That would be pretty cool. I think we have one more question. Sorry, Mike, we might not get to you this time, but we'll get to you first next time. One more question from the audience?
Not so much a question, but in the e-health sector, and I'm listening to the discussion on security of data, and it applies generally, it's the in-house risk. So there's a lot of focus on the external agencies formulating regulation and so on, but much responsibility needs to be accepted in-house because it's demonstrated by Snowden and other examples in the general e-world that the greater risk is in-house, control over access and unauthorised access and use of personal data, any data. I just wanted to make a comment on that. I'm just hearing all the focus about external agencies taking responsibility, mm-hmm. but that's not the whole story.
Yeah, and not to just point to another agency now, but that's kind of what HIPAA gets at. Is HIPAA's the privacy rule is actually more of a disclosure rule. It has nothing to do with the collection of the information. It's all about who has access to it, and then the privacy and security steps go toward limiting that access appropriately and keeping it confidential. So I think that's a great point, though. Yeah.
Mike, can I get you to make an announcement about your survey? And if you have a quick point, please do make it.
I have one comment to make. I think it's very quick, and then I'll do that.
Please, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to encourage you to do is to look at the ISO regulations around medical and personal robotics. There's a TC 184, I believe, that discusses a lot of what we've been talking about now within specific contexts of medical robotics and also personal care robotics. And there's a standard draft out, 13482, I believe.
Yep.
So those are very germane to what you've been talking about. Not a question, but I'll let that go.
Well, let me thank the panelists, and then I'll have you stay up there for a second. So, fantastic. Thank you so much to you both and your co-authors. Please join me in thanking you.